Noam Chomsky, linguist. Noam Chomsky is professor of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A leading figure in the global justice movement, Chomsky scrutinizes state power and the propaganda system on which it relies. Among his more than 100 books are Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, and Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media, with Edward S. Herman. In this interview, Chomsky discusses the origins of his social engagement, the systematic biases of foreign affairs coverage, the recruitment of children in consumerism, and his own sources of hope. Question: do you believe that universities can be non-political? On a more personal level, how have you yourself negotiated between being faithful to your beliefs and accepting socialization in order to gain the authority you now have as a university professor and renowned political thinker? Noam Chomsky. When I went to Harvard, this university did not look like this. It was well-dressed white males. I went through not only Harvard, but the ultra-socialization sector of Harvard, the Harvard Society of Fellows, where you were socialized into the ways of the elite, how to dress, how to talk, how to walk. No women, of course, in those days, except for the women who served the elegant meals. You can survive it. You have a choice. You do not have to conform to it. Plenty of people did not conform to it. That is why Harvard looks the way it does today. The country was civilized by the activism of the 1960s. That is why the 60s are so hated. And if you take a course about the 60s, they will probably tell you how awful it was. It was awful. It democratized the country. It civilized the country. It raised all kinds of issues that were off the agenda, like women's rights, civil rights, and the environment. A lot of things you were not supposed to think about and did not think about. Election edition. Which is the failed state? Is it Haiti or America? Noam Chomsky. For example, we're having something in November called an election. Suppose someone from Mars was watching this and trying to figure out what was going on. There are two candidates, both of them born to great wealth and political power. Both of them went to the same elite university. Both of them joined the same secret society where they were socialized into the manners and style of the ruling class, and both of them are able to run because they are supported by basically the same narrow concentrations of economic power. Is that an election? By some standards, it is. By others, it would be considered a failed state. But we accept it because we are indoctrinated into accepting it. Unless you do some research, you won't find out that this is by no means universal. Another example is Haiti. Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere. The United States is the richest country in the hemisphere. Haiti is what we call a failed state. The recent period that led to Haiti being a failed state starts in 1990, when Haiti had its first free election. After an awful history, it was taken for granted that the victor in this election would be the U.S. candidate. No one had been paying attention, but in Haiti, a real democratic society had developed of the kind we cannot even imagine. There had been a lot of organizing and activism in the slums and in the hills, where almost all the population lives in extreme poverty. When it got to the point where a lively civil society had developed, they were able to elect their own candidate, a populist priest named Aristide, who came to office in 1991. In the richest country in the hemisphere, that is an unimaginable election. In the poorest country in the hemisphere, they could carry it off. It is interesting to notice what happened and how Haiti descended into becoming a more desperate place than it was. The U.S. was utterly appalled by the election and immediately withdrew its funding to the government and instead diverted the funding to what is called the Democratic Opposition, which is a technical term that means business groups and other groups that want to subordinate the country to the U.S. The U.S. was so appalled by the election that it actually changed its immigration policies. The U.S. had an immigration policy towards Haiti. It was completely illegal and radically in violation of elementary principles of international humanitarian law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The U.S. had Haiti under a blockade that was instituted by President Carter, part of elevating human rights to be the soul of our foreign policy. Haiti was then under the rule of brutal, murderous dictators supported by the U.S., which meant that anyone fleeing Haiti was by definition an economic refugee, not a political refugee, and therefore they were not allowed out of the country. If they made it here, they were sent back. You are not a political refugee if you escaped the torture chamber of a dictator that we are supporting. That changed when they had democratic elections. For the first time, the US began accepting refugees as political refugees because they were fleeing from a country that had a democratically elected president. It did not really matter much because not a lot of people were fleeing the country. In fact, the flow was in the other direction. It was a moment of hope, but the official policy was shifted. Well, policy went back to normal in September 1991 when the anticipated military coup took place and a murderous, brutal gang of thugs took power. A military junta supported by a tiny rich elite. Then US policy went back to the norm. From then on, people fleeing became economic refugees again, and they could not get in. The Organization of American States imposed an embargo on Haiti. George Bush I announced right away that the United States was going to violate it. That is, he exempted US firms from the embargo. The New York Times described it as a humanitarian move of what they called fine-tuning the embargo for the benefit of the people of Haiti. In fact, the US trade with Haiti, meaning the junta and the rich elite, continued while the population was being ground in the dust. I was there during the period of the terror, and it was really horrendous. It turned out later that under Clinton, trade increased. It also turned out, though it has yet to be reported outside the business press, that the Clinton administration had authorized the Texaco Oil Company to ship oil to the military junta in violation of presidential directives. Think about it for a moment. Oil is the core part of an embargo. The CIA was reporting regularly to Congress that all flow of oil to Haiti had been stopped. Meanwhile, if you walked around the streets of Port-au-Prince, you could see the oil farms being built by the rich families and the oil tankers in the harbor. Finally, in September 1994, the Clinton administration decided that the population had been tortured enough, and they permitted the elected president to return. There is a phrase for that here. It is called restoring democracy, and we are very proud of it because it shows our commitment to democracy. But what no one bothers to report is that Clinton permitted Aristide to return, but on the condition that he accept the program of the defeated US candidate in the 1990 election. You can return, you can have democracy as long as you do what we tell you and not what the people in the slums and the hills voted for. That is what we call restoring democracy. The program that the Clinton administration imposed on the government as it returned was a very harsh neoliberal program of the kind which Mr. Summers administered in his former life in the Treasury Department. A program which opened Haiti's economy completely to a flow of foreign goods. What does that mean? For example, Haitian rice farmers are very poor, but they are pretty efficient. However, they cannot conceivably compete with exports from US agribusiness, which gets maybe 40% of its profits from subsidies that are given to them by the Reagan administration in accord with our love of free market. Naturally, as predicted, Haitian rice farmers were wiped out. Now we lament that Haiti somehow cannot feed itself. Big surprise, it is the miracle of the free market. Haiti did have a couple of small industries that were working. For example, the industry of packaging chicken parts was functioning and making some money. It turns out that Americans do not like dark meat, so the big corporations like Tyson have a lot of extra dark meat on their hands, and they would like to dump it somewhere. They tried to dump it on Canada and Mexico, but they did not have democracy restored there, so they were able to impose anti-dumping restrictions. However, Haiti is different. There, thanks to our love for democracy, they cannot stop it. Therefore, chicken parts were dumped on Haiti, and that killed that industry. It was perfectly obvious in 1994 that the program the US was forcing on Haiti was going to destroy what was left of the economy and drive the country into chaos and disruption. That is what happened. It imploded pretty predictably. Bush II made it worse by blocking foreign aid on completely frivolous grounds, but by then, the damage had already been done. If you look at the reporting in the last few weeks, it is all about Haiti, the failed state, where we tried to do nation building because we are so magnificent, and we tried to restore democracy, but they have a bad culture, or maybe bad genes or something, so they just could not handle it and fell apart. Maybe we should go back and try nation building even harder, since it worked so well for the first time. Well, that's Haiti. Who is the failed state again? Is it the state that actually had a democratic election of extremely poor people over terrible odds and managed to elect their own candidate? Or is it the state that crushed it and would not tolerate it and is having an election of the kind we are having in November? Question. How does your research on the negative effects the media can have affect your views on the way that we should raise our children? Noam Chomsky. First of all, if you're well educated, you should not be using the word children. There's a technical term for those small things. They are called, quote, evolving consumers. I'm not joking. In the institution that pretty much runs the country, the public relations industry that serves the business world, which spends maybe $2 trillion on marketing, maybe a sixth of the GDP, it runs elections and it is the core of the media and information systems. They have some principles. One of the principles is to keep the population passive and obedient and marginalized. It was recognized in the 1920s in the more free countries like England and the United States that people have won too much freedom for it to be possible to control them simply by force, the way it had been done in the past. Therefore, you had to control their attitudes and opinions and beliefs, more subtle ways of controlling them. That is when the public relations industry and the advertising business took off. It was frankly called propaganda in those days. The leading figure in the industry wrote a major textbook called Propaganda, which was about how to control people's minds and attitudes to make sure that the enlightened minority, namely us, can run the place without being bothered by the rabble. The rabble will be off doing their own things. They have to be directed to what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and you have to impose on them a philosophy of futility, a sense that they really can't do anything, and so they might as well buy shoes. On privatization. Noam Chomsky. Meanwhile, the public schools are underfunded on purpose. If you want to destroy a public school system, what you do is underfund it so that it doesn't work. Then you can say the only answer is privatization, so you hand it over to unaccountable private tyrannies called corporations. They make it even worse, but then what can you do? The British railway system is a perfect example. Our health system is a good example. You underfund the schools, people want out, and you work out various devices like vouchers. Sooner or later, if they get bad enough, people will not want them anymore, and then you will have eliminated the source of democratization and egalitarian development. Question. Who or what has inspired you now and in the past? What keeps you from becoming too disillusioned? Noam Chomsky. The second question is the easiest. Just think about the world 40 years ago and the world today. There's quite a significant change across the board. Attitudes, beliefs, personal behaviors, interactions, the way you dress. Think back to the 60s and what there wasn't. There wasn't a women's movement. There wasn't an environmental movement. There was virtually no anti-war movement. That came in the late 60s after years and years of war. There was no third world solidarity movement, no global justice movement. All sorts of things that are part of our lives just didn't exist. These things have come over the last 40 years because people aren't willing to become disillusioned. Either you can say, I gave up, in which case you can be sure the worst thing is going to happen, or you can say, okay, I'm going to be committed to trying to make things better and make things better. So there's nothing to be disillusioned about. As to what's inspiring, it's the way people struggle. You see it all over the world. I recently went to both Turkey, including Kurdish areas, and Colombia, two countries that are very high on the list of violence and atrocities, and also happen to be, not by accident, the two leading recipients of US military aid, aside from Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. The people are not giving up. Turkish and Colombian intellectuals don't ask, what can I do? Writers, journalists, artists, and academic figures are constantly carrying out protests. In Colombia, they get their heads blown off. In Turkey, they can get sent to Turkish prisons for years or much of their lives for telling what's going on. They're not giving up. Just like campesinos and indigenous people and Afro-Colombians who are being driven off their lands by chemical warfare and fumigation with US aid and US military forces. But they're not complaining. They're constantly protesting.